All right, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 12. 2 Kings chapter 12.
Okay.
2 Kings 12. It's not a overly long chapter here, so we'll go ahead and just read through it. It says, in the 7th year of Jehu, Jehoash began to reign. And Jehoash, by the way, is just an alternate spelling for Joash. They kind of go back and forth. In the 7th year of Jehu, Joash began to reign, and 40 years reigned in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Zebiah of Beersheba. And Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all his days, wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him. But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places. And Joash said to the priest, all the money of the dedicated things that is brought into the house of the Lord, even the money of everyone that passeth the account, the money that every man is set at, and all the money that cometh into any man's heart to bring into the house of the Lord, let the priest take it them, every man of his acquaintance, and let them repair the breaches of the house, wheresoever any breach be found. But it was so that in the 23rd year of King Joash, that the priest had not repaired the breaches of the house. And then King Joash, he called for Jehoiada the priest and the other priests, and he said unto them, why repair you not the breaches of the house? Now therefore receive no more money of your acquaintance, but deliver it for the breaches of the house. And the priest consented to receive no more money of the people, neither to repair the breaches of the house. But Jehoiada the priest took a chest, and he bored a hole in the lid of it, and he set it beside the altar on the right side as one cometh into the house of the Lord. And the priest that kept the door put therein all the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. And it was so, when they saw that there was much money in the chest, that the king's scribe and the high priest came up, and they put in the bags, and they told the money that was found in the house of the Lord. And they gave the money, being told into the hands of them that did the work, and that had the oversight of the house of the Lord. And they laid it out of the carpenters and the builders that wrought upon the house of the Lord, and to masons and hewers of stone, and to buy timber and huge stones to repair the breaches of the house of the Lord, and for all that was laid out for the house to repair it. Howbeit there was not made for the house of the Lord bowls of silver, snuffers of basins, trumpets of any vessels of gold, vessels of silver, or the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. But they gave that to the workmen and repaired therewith the house of the Lord. Moreover, they reckoned not with the men into whose hand they delivered the money to be bestowed upon workmen, for they dealt faithfully. The trespass money and the sin money was not brought into the house of the Lord, it was the priests. And then Hazael, the king of Syria, went up, and he fought against Gath, and he took it. And Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem. And Jehoash, the king of Judah, took all the hallowed things that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own hallowed things, and all the gold that was found in the treasures of the house of the Lord, and in the king's house, and he sent it to Hazael, king of Syria, and he went away from Jerusalem. And the rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And his servants arose and made a conspiracy and slew Joash in the house of Milo, which goeth down to Silla. For Jozachar the son of Shimeath and of Jehozabad the son of Shomer, his servants smote him, and he died. And they buried him in his father, with his fathers in the city of David. And Amaziah his son reigned in his stead. Now, obviously, last week we saw kind of the dramatic beginning to the reign of Joash, and what went into actually putting him upon the throne. As Queen Athaliah was reigning, she killed all the heirs of David except for this one boy who was stolen away, and they waited for their time. And of course, at a very, very young age, they put Joash on the throne. And I told you several times last week that Joash was an important figure, and it's not necessarily because of the great things that he did. We'll talk about that a little bit more tonight. But because of the fact that he represented the faithfulness of God. Because God had made certain promises to David that would have gone unfulfilled and would have been broken had he had no more heirs to sit upon the throne. And so Joash was that last possibility. He was that last remaining heir. And through him, we'll talk about here in just a second, through him, the promises to David not only were kept alive, but flourished. Okay, and so we'll see how that takes place. So he was an important figure for the time in which he reigned. He not only continued, as I just said, he continued the line of David at a time where it was at its highest risk to end, but he also made, as we just read there, the needed repairs to the temple that would allow for future worship to be done properly. And it's obvious by what we just read here that over the course of time, the temple had become neglected. And as the temple began to go, that was a sign of the neglect of the proper means of worship that was taking place in the nation. We already know that Athaliah was trying to bring in Baal worship because of the influence of Ahab and Jezebel and all that they did in Israel. And so it was getting a foothold in Judah. All these idolatrous practices, things like that, it was gaining strength and notoriety in the nation of Judah. Obviously not to the degree that it was in Israel, but as the nation began to kind of wane spiritually, the physical stature of the temple was kind of a picture of the spiritual state of the nation. And so it needed repairs. And so we'll see that here in just a minute. But Joash, he's an interesting figure. He's a man who listened well to spiritual authority. And we talked a lot about Jehoiada last week. Jehoiada and his wife are obviously the ones who actually, stole away Joash and kept him hidden from Athaliah while he was being raised. But the text specifically tells us this in an interesting way. It says, Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all his days. And then it adds this addendum, wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him. And so Joash was doing right things, good things, spiritual things, as long as he had Jehoiada there leading and guiding him. But unfortunately, Jehoiada died eventually. And when he died, we don't see it so much in Kings. The author of Chronicles really is where we get this information. But Joash kind of goes off the deep end a little bit. And it's because he had that godly influence over him. But unfortunately, that godly influence ended with Jehoiada, and he apparently didn't have somebody else to kind of take up that mantle and guide him as they should have. He was not a perfect man. We know that. They never had a perfect king. That didn't exist. But he did some good things. But obviously, we see there, the text specifically tells us he failed to remove all the high places. He squashed the Baal worship that was taking place. I guess you could say technically Jehoiada did that too, but it was under his rule. He squashed the worshiping that was taking place, but he didn't take down all the high places. And his faithfulness, like I said, it essentially ended with the death of Jehoiada. But flawed as he may have become, he started well, but flawed as he may have become, his reign was the beginning of a much needed time for the nation of Judah. And you can really sense this because of the way in which both of these nations end. Now, we've talked about this, and we'll talk about it more as we get closer to the actual end of Israel. But Israel did not last nearly as long as Judah did. And there's one reason. And you could say it had to do with politics. It had to do with the political savvy of the king. And those things may have played a role and may have been means to an end. But the reason why Judah lasted longer is because every now and then God was merciful to Judah and gave them a godly king on the throne. That is why they lasted longer, because Israel never had one. After the death of Solomon, they did not have a single good king. And so that's why the nation ended much, much sooner than Judah did. And so Joash here was the beginning of you could say a revival of sorts. I'll quote Constable here. He says as well. He says, with the beginning of Joash's reign, Judah began to enjoy over 100 years of consecutive leadership by 4 men whom the writer of Kings judged good. Now, none of these 4, and they are Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, and Jotham, none of them were as good for Judah as Asa and Jehoshaphat had been, or as Hezekiah or Josiah would be. Nevertheless, together, and this is what's fascinating to me, together they provided the longest continuous span of God-approved leadership in Judah's history. And so keep in mind what this is following. Right? This is following the reign of Athaliah. This was following the reign of probably the most wicked ruler Judah ever had, or at least close. And so she did all kinds of sorts of terrible things, brought in all this false worship and things like that. And so the reign of Joash, again, as I said at the beginning, it came at the necessary time. Was he everything that the people needed? No, he wasn't. He was a flawed man. Who listened well, but let me just later on I'm going to quote Wiersbe. I think it is Wiersbe said he was a man who listened well, but he didn't lead well, and that really sums up the reign of Joash. He listened well, but he did not lead well. He could have done so much more for the nation. He could have brought them so much closer to God. He failed to do that, but he did what was necessary for God's promises to come to pass and for the blessings of God to continue to flow to the people of Judah. And so, like I said, it's hard to overstate how important he was, and I think it's easy to overlook it because of some of the things that he did. And again, it's hard to say it all because it's not written here. You see that more in the book of Chronicles, and we're going to turn there here in a little bit to see kind of how they describe the end of his life. But nevertheless, we know that it wasn't all good. But he did have this one kind of defining legacy. So the defining legacy of Joash's reign would be the repairs he made to the temple. And it was important, like I mentioned at the beginning. It was a sign of God's favor kind of coming back to the people. And it was a sign of their renewed fervor for the covenant. And we talked about this last week. As Joash was installed as and anointed as king, what did the people do? They essentially renewed the covenant with God. They made the statement that we will follow the Lord. We will do what God wants us to do. And again, Jehoiada was the driving force behind all of that. But the repairs to the temple was kind of this physical sign of what was taking place spiritually with the people. And so this was not going to be the only time, and it was not going to be the most significant time that the temple was repaired. Obviously, if you know this period of the kings, the repairs that take place under Josiah would end up being kind of the most significant time that ever took place. But this is an important thing, and it marked a trajectory for the nation of Judah, as I just said, that was completely opposite to the reign of Athaliah. And so Joash here begins a new policy, and I'll just kind of condense the information that we have here down a little bit. He begins this new policy that essentially they would take part of the incoming offerings that were used for the upkeep of the Levites, right? So the Levites, to go back to the kind of the beginning of their time in Canaan, the Levites were not given a portion of the land. They were going to be taken care of by the offerings, by what came into the temple. And that is what the Levites would live off of. And so here, Joash said, the assumption is temporarily divert some of the income that was coming for the priests, and that was going to go to the repairs that need to be made. Now, we don't know at what time that was instituted. We don't know what year he came up with this idea and what year they started to do it. But we are told that by the 23rd year of his rule, the repairs had still not yet taken place. Now, the built-in assumption to that is that it had been a long time. By the fact that he tells us it's already year 23 and this hasn't taken place, I think we can safely assume it wasn't instituted in year 22. I think we can safely assume this has been a long time and these repairs still had not yet taken place. And so he sits down with the priests and basically, tells them what's going on. Why is this not yet taking place? Which is another good sign that Joash was taking the initiative to make sure that God's house was properly cared for. But he sits down with the priests, and essentially they tell him, we're not going to do it. That's kind of what it boils down to. We're not going to do it. And so to rectify this, Jehoiada, again, steps into play here. He essentially just puts an offering box by the altar. And it says, if you want to give in addition to the normal temple offerings, and there were offerings for a variety of things that they had to give under the covenant. But if you want to give in abundance to that, you can put it in this box, and that box will go for the repairs. And that ended up being a tremendous success. In honesty, that's kind of not too dissimilar from the system that we continue to use today, right? If you give to the church, unless it's specified, that money just goes into what we call the general offering, and that just is basically used however the church sees fit. But you have the option to say, I'm donating this money for this purpose. And I'm very dogmatic about the fact that if you donate money for a purpose, that money is used for that purpose. And so I don't think it's right for me or for anybody else to come along and say, well, they gave this for that, but we need it over here, so we're just going to bump that money here. We don't do that. And part of the reason is, kind of what we see right here. They gave for the purpose of the upkeep and the repairs for the temple, it wouldn't have been right for the priest to come along and say, well, we really need to buy some more supplies, or we need this stuff. No, it was given for a purpose, and that's what they used it for, and God blessed it. In fact, you see where it says later on in verse 16 that not only were the repairs made, they paid everything that they needed to pay for the repairs. All the, for lack of a better phrase, the construction workers, they got their due. They got what they were supposed to get. The repairs were made, and the priests didn't lose anything. They still got everything that they needed to get. And so this was an overall, pretty much a grand success. And so this was everything that it needed to be. And again, all it was a physical sign of what was taking place in the heart of the people, spiritually speaking. And I think the reason why the author kind of spends so much time on this is really twofold. Like I said, number one, it says kind of the defining legacy of Joash. But then number two, he's setting up a contrast. And so we spend so much time talking about the needed repairs that were taking place and how the temple was being cared for, and how finally after, again, we don't know how long, but after a long time, the temple has finally kind of gotten back to the position that it was supposed to be, and how it was perhaps even when it was first built. And then we see verses 17 and 18. And so verses 17 and 18, a familiar face pops up. You have Hazael, the king of Syria. Again, he's been kind of a thorn in the side of Israel for a long time now. And so he begins to attack, and originally he's attacking Gath. He's attacking kind of the coastal area, but his intention was to make his way to Jerusalem. And so what does Joash do? Joash does, unfortunately, what a lot of the kings of this time did. He plundered the temple to pay off the invaders. And this is what he does. And so after spending so much time, the bulk of this chapter talking about the repairs of the temple, immediately Joash is the one who, instituted the repairs that needed to be made. Joash is the one who came in and plundered it. And so what is kind of missing in this chapter that we find out later in 2 Chronicles is that it was between the completion of those repairs and the invading of Syria that Jehoiada dies. And so it was in that interim period where Joash lost that godly influence that he had had for his whole life. And so, again, I can't say with certainty that if Jehoiada had still been alive that this wouldn't have happened. But it's obviously no coincidence that after the death of Jehoiada, Joash would have seen it as kind of no big deal to go in and plunder the temple as he does. Go ahead and make your way over to 2 Chronicles 24, just very quickly. Won't spend much time over here, but we kind of see some details here that we don't get in 2 Kings. And so this is going to be filling us in on this little time period after the death of Jehoiada. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 17, it says, 2 Chronicles 24, verse 17. Now after the death of Jehoiada came the princes of Judah and made obeisance to the king, and then the king hearkened unto them, and they left the house of the Lord God of their fathers, and they served groves and idols, and wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this their trespass. Yet he sent prophets to them to bring them again to the Lord, and they testified against them, but they would not give ear. And the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, who stood above the people, and he said unto them, Thus saith God, why transgress ye the commandments of the Lord, that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he hath also forsaken you. And they conspired against him and stoned him with stones, look at this, at the commandment of the king, in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king remembered not the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but slew his son. And when he died, he said, The Lord look upon it and require it. And so you see that not only did he kind of almost immediately, and again, we don't know the exact period of time between his death and these events, but almost immediately upon the death of Jehoiada, immediately what he had stamped out kept creeping back in. Idolatry and idolatrous practices. And then he went so far to say, to the very son of the man who had, for all lack of a better, he had been his father. He wasn't just his godly influence. Jehoiada raised him, right? Jehoiada was his father in every sense of that word. And so now Jehoiada's son, prophesying rightly so, against this new kind of wickedness that Joash was doing. And what did Joash do? You got to silence that. So he has him killed. And so again, as I mentioned this earlier, but Wiersbe got it exactly right. Joash was an excellent follower, but he was not a good leader. He was an excellent follower, but he was not a good leader. Now, like Jehu, we talked about this with the king of Israel. He had, it wasn't a similar beginning, but they were both kind of miraculous in their own right. And they had an amazing beginning. Both of them kind of rose up at a time that it was unexpected. Both of them were responsible for kind of removing the influence of Ahab in their respective countries. Both of them were responsible for removing the houses of worship for Baal and killing the priests and doing all of that. But both of them had a frustratingly bad finish. They had a frustratingly bad finish. And like I said, we don't get all the details here in Kings, but he does give us a little bit of a hint. He gives us a little snippet, and you see it in verse 20. It says, "And his servants arose and made a conspiracy and slew Joash in the house of Milo, which goeth down from Silla." And so we see this is not a respectable end. This was not a respectable end because Joash himself did not have a respectable end. But even in the midst of political assassination here, there was still good news in Judah. Because of the actions of Jehoshaphat and Jehoiada, because they took him, hid him, and then eventually anointed him, put him on the throne, and ultimately, I will say, because of the actions of God himself, the line of David continues still, because the very last line of the chapter, in verse 21, it says, "And Amaziah his son reigned in his stead." There wasn't a worry of, is there going to be an heir of David? There wasn't a worry of, are the promises of God going to be propagated? All of that had gone out the window as soon as Joash was put on the throne. And so he begins to have children. They begin to reign, as I said earlier, over 100 years of consecutive reigns by men who overall obviously had some bumpy points in the road. Overall, were not perfect men, but overall were deemed, if you looked at the totality of the reign, as a good net positive for the land of Judah. Over 100 years of successful reign. And so I'll close here with a quote from David. He said, again, "The failure of Joash should only lift our eyes to the descendant of David who does not disappoint. There is a built-in defect in all merely human leadership." And he adds this. He says, "And recognizing this will save you from much anger and gnashing of teeth in the church. But the failure and folly of men should only make us crave and enjoy the fullness and faithfulness of Jesus all the more." And so you have all of these heirs of David. You have all of these kings sitting on the throne. Some were better than others. Some did great things. Some did very bad things. But again, none were perfect. And every time you had a man sitting on the throne and showed his weaknesses, showed his failures, showed his temptations, showed all of these sins that were existing in his life, it just screamed out for the need of the one who would come who was perfect. It would scream out for the need for the son of David to sit on the throne forever, who was going to be the perfect king. And we know, we have a perspective that they didn't, that would actually be God himself, who was going to come in the form of man, be the son of David, who was going to institute a spiritual kingdom first. But obviously we understand is coming back to set up that earthly kingdom where he will sit on that throne of David. And he will rule, the Bible tells us, with a rod of iron. And it will be a perfect kingdom. And so this is what the people needed. It's what we still need. It's what they expected, and it is what will eventually come. Joash, a fascinating character, an interesting reign, but one that ultimately, again, just like they all do, point us forward in hope for the one that's coming.